Welcome to today's conversation. I'm Jasmine Hood Miller, Director of Family Resources at Common Sense Media, and we're so appreciative of you joining us. This is a timely discussion, and I don't say that because of something specific that has happened today or this week, although I'm sure there is something or some things, but because of exactly that, it seems there's always a news story, event, or happening that makes us as parents, just do a quick pause because we're trying to think about how it impacts our children and how do we talk with them in a way that they'll understand. Online platforms and social media have been the way that we've learned about current events for years now. And for our kids, it's often their primary news source. But with the way that these platforms are designed, kids can come across disturbing images and videos without necessarily seeking them out, often without full context and sometimes before they're ready to process what they've seen. So, to unpack all of this and provide real actionable tips for parents and caregivers, I'm pleased to introduce our guest today. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Earl Turner. Dr. Earl, as his patients call him, is a licensed psychologist and tenured associate professor at Pepperdine University. He's also the executive director of Therapy for Black Kids and author of Raising Resilient Black Kids. For the last 15 years, he's held leadership positions serving on boards and committees for the American Psychological Association, APA, and other professional organizations. But most importantly, Dr. Earl has helped kids process and navigate trauma and improve their mental well being. And our next guest is my wonderful colleague, Bianca De Jesus. Bianca is senior editor of digital media at Common Sense and is our resident go to person on all kids' online activities from AI to social media to EdTech. Bianca develops guidance for parents and educators on using media and technology safely and effectively. And she knows kind of all about the complicated lives of kids online and breaks it down for us in easy to understand terms. And before joining Common Sense, Bianca was a learning specialist at TEDx. So welcome, Dr. Earl and Bianca.
Thank you so much for having
Um,
me.
I'm going to start with you, Dr. Earl. I'd like to begin with, our kids are and young people's feeds are flooded with scary news and problematic content constantly, right? It's being pushed to them, or their friends might be showing it to them. And whether we're talking about war and conflict or really inappropriate things like memes and games designed to simulate real trauma, fictionalize actual people and situations. So, like, insert problematic public figure here. And it just all kind of feels a little too casual. Can you help parents understand what happens psychologically? What is the kind of mental and emotional impact on our kids' health when they're exposed to these traumatic or disturbing videos or images on social media and other platforms?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think now for many of our children, they're growing up in this digital space where many of us did not as a child. And so the way that our brains are set up to process information is that we're consuming this content, and oftentimes, whether it's about violence in the community, war, racial discrimination, natural disasters, the brain perceives this information as a threat and that it's actually happening to them. And so I think as we recognize this exposure that children encounter, that this is having an impact on their brain. The exposure leads to stress responses in certain systems of the brain. And so that leads to increases in anxiety for children. They may have fear. And oftentimes, I think what I see is children have a lot of sleep problems because they are like replaying this trauma in their brain as they're trying to go to sleep. So it's really important to recognize how this exposure can mirror trauma that they experience in their real lives, and that it's not just news to them, especially if you live in a community that has already been impacted by different types of violence, that these experiences online can almost feel personal. So I think it's necessary that we realize that this repeated exposure to this type of image through technology can create desensitization, so like normalizing the exposure to these traumatic experiences for children. And it could also lead to really strong emotional reactions. So it is really important that parents remember that kids don't always have the developmental tools or even emotional capacity to process what they're seeing. And so we want to be able to engage in a healthy conversation with them about what they're witnessing, but also provide some practical ways for them to cope and manage the emotions that they're experiencing when they are contacted by this unfiltered information.
Yeah. And so, I mean, ideally, we'd like to shield our kids from even coming across, these problematic images and videos. And we'll just, discuss in a little bit some preventative measures that parents can take. But how can parents broach these topics in a developmentally appropriate way, as you describe, based on that child's age and their maturity or temperament, in to be able to learn what their kids know, what they've seen and been exposed to, and then just actually talk to them about those topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with what you're saying about it is really helpful to like minimize as much contact to these images and disturbing things just in real life in general. But also I think as a psychologist, I often talk with parents about like being too overprotective then almost sets the child up for like failure and not having the tools to navigate really difficult, challenging experiences. So I do think that having some awareness about how these things are impacting children and to really be intentional about broaching the topics are really necessary and important. So for me, I think a huge piece is how do we approach this conversation with a sense of curiosity, really trying to understand like what do children already know about what they're seeing, and how they may be impacted by this as opposed to sort of starting the conversation with assumptions about what they do or don't know. So I think that's sort of the first step. I also think how do you engage that conversation initially is also really important. So I like to encourage parents to really sort of set the stage for these types of conversations, and by allowing them first to let the child know that, hey, this is what I've experienced or witnessed. So maybe starting with, I've seen some really disturbing information on social media. Has there been any information that you've come across that's been really disturbing? What type of content have you seen lately, and like what are your experiences about that particular content in terms of does it make you more afraid or anxious? Like what emotions are you feeling? I think that's a safe place to start that conversation so that kids also see like, hey, mom or dad is also like seeing certain things that may be a little bit distressing. And so that helps normalize that this is not something unique that they may be experiencing themselves. I also think that it's helpful to create a really safe environment. So, really making sure that if you know that your child has been exposed to certain distressing content, is that you really validate the experiences. So, really letting the child know that you understand that the information that they consumed is either confusing or makes them upset. Try to minimize some of this exposure as well. So I think working with the child to have them set healthy boundaries around accessing social media so that way that distances themselves sometimes for this repeated exposure from this distressing information, and really helping the child process what they've saw. So as I shared before, opening up that dialogue and asking kids about what they think they understood from the information, how does it make them feel, and then asking them if they have any questions for them as a parent about some of this information, because I think that also helps to clear up misinformation that children may be exposed to. As we know, AI, sometimes a lot of content is created and it's not real. And so I think those are also really important conversations to have with kids as a way to talk about this exposure that they may be encountering.
I think that a lot of times what I try to help parents do is reflect on their own experience and think about how challenging it is for us as adults, right? All the things that we see, and then imagine, what that is for a child, and kind of put yourself in their shoes and be able to reflect on your own experience and then be able to bring that to the conversation. So I really like what you were just saying about, um, kind of talking to your children that like you're experiencing it too. You're seeing these things, they are upsetting to you too. How do you feel about it? Sharing your thoughts and ways of processing, and then also sharing those family values of, this is what's happening, this is what we see, and this is kind of what we as a family are grounded in, and how to kind of move forward from there. And I think this is actually like a great segue to Bianca with some of your insights, because as parents, we'd love to have, some level of control around what our kids see. And, but there's just so much content out there. Like you can't control all of it, but maybe there's ways to minimize, even for ourselves too, right? Like I think some of these tips may even be helpful just for us, as adults and parents and caregivers. But what are some parents may already know this, right? But can you like quickly explain, Bianca, how algorithms work? How is it that all of this stuff is kind of showing up for our kids, and how tech companies are essentially just determining what our kids see?
Sure. So platforms like YouTube, TikTok, other social media platforms, they're optimized for engagement, which means that watch time, clicks, any kind of interaction that you have with those videos is going to play a part in curating the content that comes up. And it's specific to the user and meant to keep them on the platform. So age appropriateness isn't necessarily top of mind or a priority at a lot of these places. So the content that is shown is often inappropriate for kids and can often lead to other inappropriate videos once you watch one of them.
And so as parents try to help teens regain some of this like level of control and agency over their social media feed, I think that's, we want to empower our kids to not just feel like they are on just the receiving or consuming end of it, but have some control. Can the algorithms be manipulated or recalibrated? Like what can we do to kind of like adjust?
Sure. You can improve your algorithm or your child's algorithm, but it requires regular maintenance and intention setting, and it's not a foolproof plan. So, resetting your algorithm from scratch could be helpful in the short term, but remember that will erase all of your content. So, good content, bad content, and it'll start your child's algorithm from scratch. And often that can mean that more harmful content is introduced because it's going to give them generic content for their age. So your teenage boy might get content about the manosphere, for example, because it's going to target that particular age group. So instead, what you can do to curate is to make sure that your child proactively follows. Uh, Also, a lot of these tips are dependent on your child's age, so keep that in mind. Whether or not you specifically run your child's social media accounts or if they run their own, but you want to make sure that their account proactively follows positive accounts or unfollows accounts that they don't want to see or even blocks those accounts. Make sure that your child knows that every post that they interact with will change their algorithm in some way. So whether they like a photo or a reel or save it or share it with their friends, even the time that they spend on each post will help to craft the things that they see. So whether or not they're watching it because they like it or because they don't like it, the algorithm doesn't tell the difference and can promote similar content. Take a look at the hashtags of those posts as well, before taking any of those actions, because you're going to receive content that is like the thing that you just interacted with. And then encourage your kid to skip or close inappropriate videos quickly. If they don't want to see it, just move along or you can block it. Some other really cool things, Instagram has a bunch of specific features that you can take a look at to help curate the content even more. So you can use the I'm not interested option that will pop up on some reels, or even add topics to avoid. You can take a look at your content preferences. There's a lot that you can do there in terms of blocking specific terms, phrases that you don't want to see, brands, even certain types of ads. Now, this isn't going to work all the time, but it's a good start in terms of just looking through and seeing what your options are. Another option is that you can snooze suggested content in your general feed, but that only works for 90 days before you receive more content like that. You can also limit sensitive content, but Instagram decides what they determine is sensitive content. But you can decide whether or not you want to see less of it, more of it, or just the same. We also have a bunch of parent control guides that walk through the settings of how to pair your device with your child's device when it comes to Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. TikTok has a lot of great parental control features that you can take a look at, as well as YouTube too.
That is actually super helpful, and it's helpful to know that each. I mean, it makes our job as parents a little harder, but it's helpful to know that each platform has different features and options that available to kind of do this curation. And you mentioned it's not like a set it and forget it. And so I think that's something that for parents to keep in mind, that it is, something that you kind of have to do regularly. How often would you have to do this? Is it something, I know you mentioned not necessarily fully resetting, but is it like this constant curation? Like how often would you recommend parents helping their kids do this?
Yeah, so just like you said, it's regular maintenance needs to be done. It's not something that can just be done and then it's over and your feed is curated. It's something that happens consistently. So rather than just wiping your kid's algorithm altogether, it's good to make a habit of making those interactions really intentional, that they're having with every piece of content that they come across. Like I mentioned, the likes that they're sending, everything that they're sharing with their friends, making sure that your kid is really up to date on online literacy and what that means to you and your family, so that they can come to you with any content that they feel uncomfortable with or something that makes them feel emotions that they don't like. And the decision about what you and your kid want to see in your feeds needs to be coupled with the kid making decisions about what they want to see online. And that happens every day. It's not something that can just be done at once.
Dr. Earl, you mentioned earlier some coping mechanisms or coping skills in our digital literacy and well-being curriculum from Common Sense. We teach kids a technique called critical ignoring, which is basically choosing what information to pay attention to and what to ignore, kind of based on reliability and usefulness of that information. How can families find a healthy balance about talking about news and current events, and with their kids without necessarily putting blinders on or pretending like things aren't happening in the world, but also not exposing them to the traumatic stuff or the problematic content? Where is that balance, and what are some of the other coping skills that kids can use to improve their online experience and prioritize their well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Echoing what you and Bianca said, I think it's so important that parents are engaging in digital literacy for themselves. I'll say that over. So agreeing with what you and Bianca mentioned around digital literacy, I think is important for parents to understand that for themselves, but also that they're teaching their kids, especially teens, about this because there's so much more independence for them engaging with technology. I do think that it's really important that you try not to like shield your kids from the reality that is going on around them. So really making sure that you teach them how to like filter the types of exposure that they may be encountering, and also to have the support system around them to help them navigate these experiences as well. So one, I think it is really important that you try to be a resource for your child about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Obviously, I think with teens, how you navigate that conversation can sometimes be tricky, because if you completely try to minimize their content on these sites, then that might backfire. And so now they're going to try to engage more, because why should they stay off of these platforms? So really working with kids to talk about what they see as being age appropriate, and also for younger children to try to set some limits around what types of content that they may be exposed to. I also think that it's important to focus on not just what they're consuming, but understanding what information is having, how the information is having an impact on them. So really talking about what is happening in the content, what is happening more locally in your own community as it relates to what the child may be seeing. And also trying to, again, reduce exposure to really graphic content. So especially for younger children, this repeated exposure of these images can really be distressing. So trying to minimize as much graphic content as possible for younger children. I also think that in terms of other coping practices, really trying to set limits as a family around digital use. So, how do we as a family set moments where we can pause or check in about the type of content that children may be consuming? So, I really encourage parents often to say, check in with your child, not just about the digital content things, but also just mental health more broadly, to really ask about how they're feeling. And as it relates to content online, you know, encourage them to often check in with themselves about like what I just witnessed or saw. How did that make me feel? If I am feeling more anxious, irritated, angry, that's probably a cue for me to decide to take a break for a moment. And then I could come back to that, the next day or hours later, as opposed to continuing to sort of scroll throughout the platforms. The other piece that I think is also important as a tool is making sure that parents as well as teens understand that active sort of use on social media versus passive can have different effects on you and your mental health. So what we see from the research is a lot of like active engagement in terms of you're liking posts that or that you enjoy, you are contacting, making comments on the post or messaging your friends. That type of active engagement is much more healthy as opposed to like passive scrolling, which may make it more likely that you're going to be engaging with some maybe distressing content or content that you have maybe curated throughout your feed. And then finally, I think really working with children to make sure that they have practical strategies to ground themselves. So really taking moments to engage in some breathing. So that can really help you regulate your body and your heart rate and breathing. All of those things are really helpful to minimize the distress that you may be experiencing. Also, making sure that kids know that they have someone that they can talk to and trust. Maybe it's not you as a parent. Is there a counselor at school? Is there a friend that they feel that they could talk to about some of these things, that they can really get that support that they need when they may be encountering some of this distressing content?
Yeah, I was gonna kind of ask you. You mentioned a few minutes ago about support systems, and so finding those support systems, both for I think for kids and students, as well as for parents. Having some of those additional resources and outlets to be able to turn to, I think, are really important. And we know from research that we've done with teens that these platforms can be a double-edged sword, that they find positive community spaces, places where that they can explore their identity, be able to find other like-minded teens and young people to be able to engage with. But then it also comes with all the the negative parts of it. And so I think it in this conversation of balance, there's the things that we don't want our kids to see, but then there's also ways to, if you are engaging online, to kind of like seek out the joyful spaces, and be able to help our kids find, like, gravitate more for that, or find those spaces with the curation, and then just like you said, being able to have community um, and on and offline, right? So I think that's really important. I appreciate both of your insights, and so I just want to kind of get one last takeaway. If you were to give parents a nugget to walk away with, what that would be, and I'll start with you, Bianca.
So I think it's when it comes down to it, it's not just about parental controls. Parental controls exist and there are a ton of settings that you can look into. But what would really help is talking to your kid and checking in with them about how they feel about their time online. And then also having them be aware of how these platforms work so that when they're spending time on them, they know what's happening. I think that's really key.
Great, thank you, Dr. Earl.
Yeah, so one thing that I think is really important is engaging in co-regulation. So I think one, for parents to like model how they're setting limits on these platforms for themselves, but also if you are distressed, um, talk yourself through out loud so your kid sees like, how are you coping with this? Wow, this is a really disturbing video. I'm going to take a break from my phone for a minute. That really models healthy coping for children as opposed to saying, stay off of these platforms.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate this conversation and, being able to help parents kind of walk through, being able to have conversations with their children, have discussions, but then also the real things that they can, take away right away and say, hey, let's sit down and look at our settings together and figure out how to make the most of this. So I appreciate both of you and thank you for joining us. And you can find more resources and information from Common Sense at commonsensemedia.org. Take care.